All right, so you all had a video lecture in lieu of class on Wednesday, and it was all on this crazy 1920s business. America's going two different directions, isn't it? The polarization of America, which pretty much exists through a lot of American history. America is very polarized during this period of time, and we're generally polarized in America between an urban, rural, more permissive environment versus a traditional cultural one. In the 1950s and 60s was probably the time in America when we were most together. We weren't as extreme either way, and we got along pretty well. And I think that was the war, the millions of men going off and fighting together who didn't really know people from other areas than themselves, and they fought on the battlefields, and they got to know an Italian guy from New York City or Long Island, got to know a guy from Alabama. And when they got home from that war, a lot of the bigotry and the sense of they're not Americans went away. And that prevailed, this kind of sense of solidarity in America is a multicultural thing. By and large, most Americans embrace that. There are some Americans in some parts of the country that would like to go back to this idea of making America more white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. But generally speaking, they have not been a very influential group, until recently, actually. All right, there's one thing in the ID that I did not go through, and that is the Sacco and Vanzetti one. So real quickly here. 1919, 1920, we have a Red Scare in America, probably provoked by business leaders in the Chamber of Commerce and other concerned business leaders who are thinking that we've become too liberal in our economic policies, what we would call today liberal, too much government interference in the economy on behalf of workers and consumers. That over in Europe, they've had the Soviet Revolution in Russia. They tried to have one in Germany. And so in America, we make out that we're on the brink of that too. And the reason they make out that we're on the brink of that is so that they can paint anyone who wants to go more left as a radical socialist, maybe even a communist. That is this Red Scare that was provoked. Now, in the midst of that, we have an anti-immigrant upheaval in America. And the case of Sacco and Vanzetti are two Italians. I forgot what city they're in. Looks like they're in Boston. Yeah, they're in Boston. And the police force in Boston is really beginning to harass immigrants and see them as guilty for just about everything. But Sacco and Vanzetti, these two guys worked for a factory. The factory got broken into, the office safe robbed, and a night guard killed. And these two get arrested for it, and under flimsy evidence, get convicted. And the jury is mostly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who are probably influenced by their anti-immigrant feeling. And they listen to the district attorney, and they listen to the police, and they don't listen to the defense team who are laying out a good case for why these guys aren't the ones who likely did it. But they blew past all that, and they convict them to the death penalty. Now, a lot of them, Americans in Boston, obviously the immigrant population is going to be upset about this, but a lot of intellectuals in Boston who don't like what's going on with this anti-immigrant. So among the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, there are a lot who also believe this is wrong, and they tried to save these guys. This helps us give birth to something called the American, this and other things help give birth to an organization called the American, ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. Our civil liberties are our liberty from government, a heavy-handed government. They're all laid out. Our civil liberties are mostly laid out in the Bill of Rights. You know, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, our restrictions on the government when they try to go after us in a court, or they want to look into our possessions, trial by jury, all these things that are trying to prevent, or at least to a miscarriage of justice. So the ACLU, it still exists today. In 1919, 1920, they see a lot of the things that happened during the war, like the Sedition Act, And there's just growing feeling of the government is doing some things that are wrong and taking away our civil liberties. Included in this period are things like the Racial Integrity Act. The ACLU would have been upset about that. You remember the Racial Integrity Act? It made it illegal for people of two races to marry or even live in the same house. Remember that one in your video lecture? Or the Eugenical Sterilization Act, which against people's will, they were sterilized because they were thought to be unfit for repopulating. This is a horrible statement by an otherwise well-noted Supreme Court justice. You remember that? He talks about the government has a right to cut fallopian tubes of people who are thought to be imbeciles or maybe who have a genetic disease that they would pass on to their offspring. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute the degenerate offspring for crime, or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover the cutting of fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So the ACLU is an organization that looks across America with all of these heavy-handed, really the undermining of our individual freedoms. And they also were involved in the Scopes monkey trial. They thought that the Tennessee law making it illegal to present Darwin's theory of evolution in classes was also an erosion of the First Amendment. So that's what those things were involved. And I don't think I went into that very much in a video lecture. So does anybody have any other questions? Because I want to open up an open notes quiz on that lecture this weekend, and you'll take it before I see you on Monday morning. Anybody have any questions over it? A lot of you are going, oh, I'm really going to have to watch that thing, aren't I? I enjoyed my day off, right, on Wednesday. Yes, so no more questions about it? Those of you who watched it, those 3 of you? Okay. I'll leave it to the lecture for you guys to get all those IDs and take an open notes quiz on it. Did we finish all the way to the Balfour Declaration and the... did we get the Balfour Declaration of World War I the other day? Okay, so we got a little bit left there. I'll go back in time. Got a couple of things left at the tail end of the war. What's the last thing you do have written down with regard to the war? Okay.
I don't think we went over Belleau Wood.
Belleau Wood? Oh, we're that far back. We didn't do the Versailles Peace Treaty yet? Haven't really gotten into that yet. Oh, well, we got a ways to go. All right. 14 points. We get the 14 points. Okay. So the 14 points, was that the very last thing we were working on? I would imagine. Taught this thing 3 times this week, so I don't know where I am what day. Is this going to come on? Okay. The Germans are poised to bring an army that had been fighting Russia, bring it across and defeat France before we can get there. Our troops, we've got about 100,000 there in the early spring of 1918, but we're not going to get the big bulk of our army there until the summer of 1918. So June, more arriving, July, more arriving, August, we should be up to 1 million men there. But there is this moment where the Germans are going to have a chance to throw an army against France and hopefully beat France before we can get there. And they do that. They launch the attack in April and May as our troops are arriving. And they do hit hard and they do push the French back. Now, there are Americans among them. And the Battle of Belleau Wood goes down as one of the greatest display of valor by a group of Marines. In fact, the Marine Corps today looks at the Battle of Belleau Wood as the birth of the modern Marine Corps. I think it was the 2nd Brigade they were in a forest, along with French and British troops. They were kind of spread out. And the Germans, I don't know if I can draw a very good line of this, the main trench line is here, and there was some woods that was kind of like the trench stop there. The Germans hit hard against the French lines, and they send an army through the woods. The goal is to get through the woods, surprise them, and come up this way too, and then destroy the French in this one section. If they clear that, then they can bring a whole army through, if they can pull this off. Well, those who had positions in the woods were surprised by the number of Germans that came through the woods. The French and the British troops got pulled back, but the Americans were not given the word that they weren't going to hold the forest. And so they kept fighting for 2 days in this forest against overwhelming odds, and they ran out of ammunition, and they were down to like fighting hand to hand. A great number of American soldiers died, but they held up that army from being able to get around them. And after the war, the French put up a big monument in this area, not only for the Belleau Woods the men who fought there, but also generally for all the Americans who came and helped defend France. So after that Battle of Belleau Wood, and things stabilize, the Germans did not achieve that goal that they had of a knockout punch before we got there. And all during the summer, more and more Americans come in, until finally we begin to push back the German army, and we're getting the Battle of Amiens in August. We're actually beginning to push them back into Germany right there. So I don't know if I mentioned the metaphor that I think of in this. Have y'all seen rugby? Did I mention the rugby metaphor in here? You've seen rugby when they all get grouped up and they're pushing on each other? So in the spring of 1918, the Germans brought a bunch of men in, and they started pushing the French back. But then all during the summer, it's as if the people from the stands came down and got on one side and started overwhelming the other side. That's the arrival of the Americans. So by August, the Ottoman Empire drops out. By October, if not late September, the Austrian Empire drops out. They can't keep fighting. And then finally, the Germans are the only one left fighting. And so Kaiser Wilhelm has his foreign ministry call up Washington to talk to the president and says, how about these 14 points you talked about back in January? What about this negotiated peace? How about a peace without victory? What was that speech called for the 14 points? Wilson says, well, there's a 15th point now. The Kaiser's going to have to abdicate. To abdicate means to step down and to leave the throne. And Germany's going to have to become a democratic republic and no longer be an empire. That took a little while for Kaiser Wilhelm to get his head around. I don't think he ever got his head around it, and the German government let him know that this is it, we can't keep fighting. And so here's a date for you, November 11th at 11 in the morning, 11 in the morning. It's like all 11s, how about that? November 11th at 11 in the morning, 11 minutes, an armistice is going to go into effect. An armistice is an agreement to stop fighting. We're just going to agree to stop fighting. The armistice on November 11th of 18. We are coming up on the 100th anniversary of that this November. Not to be quite a few things. And that is going to be considered the date when World War I comes to an end, when the fighting stops on that date. We know that. We celebrate that day in America, right? November 11th is Veterans Day. Veterans Day. It's known as Veterans Day. It was originally known as Victory in Europe Day, but we decided to make it a day where we celebrated veterans from then on out. Call this thing the altar of Mars. Mars is the god of war. The costs of the war are horrible. Look at these. 65 million men were mobilized, brought into armed forces for this war. It's horrible, unbelievable. Of that, 9 million are dead. I've never seen that kind of numbers before. The world had never seen that kind of dead before. Another 22 million wounded, 7 million permanently, lots of missing body parts. See these men who've come back where they're horribly disfigured by all the shell fire. It's just, if you look at I've spent a lot of time when I was making my documentary film of looking at the different images, and it's just horrific what these guys came back with. Many of them suffers from something called shell shock. They would bomb. A prelude to an offensive might include a week of shelling with artillery fire, and you would just go crazy eventually. Some people did. Another 5 million men don't even come back from the war, so they don't really know what happened to them. And then we've got the direct costs, the financial costs of the war. The average daily cost of the war, of the combatants, they're spending $123 million a day, back in 1914 dollars. The last year of the war, they're spending $10 million an hour on the war. And the Allies are spending more than the Germans. The direct expenditure for the war itself is $186 billion have been spent on this war. The Allied powers have spent 126, and the Central powers spent about $60 billion. This war is going to ruin Europe. The 20th century is going to be a mess for Europe. Between this war and the worldwide economic collapse of the 1930s and the rise of fascism with Mussolini in Italy and Adolf Hitler in Germany, it's all ramifications of the war, including also the Russian Revolution with Joseph Stalin. All of that is because of this horrible, horrible war. Now, the problem is we've got to now have a peace treaty. Do y'all know the name of the peace treaty that ends World War I? That the Germans have to sign after the war? Do y'all know this one? What is it? Versailles? Yeah, it's a weird looking word, isn't it? There you go. I think I've got it. Well, it is, there it is up there, the word for you. The Versailles Treaty. Versailles, it looks weird. That's how the French say it. They just pretty much stop a route right there, Versailles, and then they don't say the rest of it. Versailles, I suppose we would say. Versailles. At any rate, Versailles is this big palace built by Louis XIV in the 1600s outside of Paris. And all of the people are going to come there and negotiate a peace treaty. I'd like you to know that it is the worst peace treaty in modern history, because peace treaties are supposed to create the terms for peace, and they do not, because World War II is going to be a continuation of World War I. And I'd like to say this about why it's such a failure. Probably the number one reason for the failure is that they refused to let the Germans come and negotiate in Paris, or at Versailles. Paris and Versailles, they're quite close together. Unlike even when Napoleon had conquered all of Europe 100 years before, the Congress of Vienna, they actually let the French government come and negotiate the settlement. The Germans will have to stay away from the treaty, and they'll be presented with a treaty when it's over. Now, this is the arrival of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson decides that he's going to go to the Paris Peace Treaty and negotiate himself. All other presidents had sent envoys or ambassadors or secretary of states to negotiate a treaty, but he thinks it's too important to rely on anybody else, and he's going to go negotiate himself. When he arrives, the crowds are tremendous in London because he seems to be, they've known about America for a long time as a land of liberty and doing things differently than Europe. And now America has come and saved Europe. And Woodrow Wilson, who's this progressive president, he's just the man of the hour. And it may have affected his viewpoint. Some historians think that he gets a little bit of a Messiah complex, Messianic complex, where he thinks that maybe he is called for this moment. And he's going to be pretty frustrated with what happens, given the feelings he had going into it. There are about 80 or to 100 nations have come to the treaty because everybody's declared war on Germany before it's over. Venezuela has declared war on Germany. Chile has declared war. I mean, everywhere where they can, they've declared war, and now they all want to be at the conference. But the real power is these four big ones. It's Woodrow Wilson here, the tall gentleman, the French president Clemenceau, or David Lord George of England, and this guy Orlando from Italy. Now, the other reason for the failure of the Versailles Treaty is, I guess, democracy. Democracy is a weird thing, right? You've got politicians who make a public appeal to vote for me. And the Europeans really had only been having a full democracy for about 20 years. And they have an election in November, December 1918. If you were running for office in December and you knew this big peace treaty was coming up, I'm sure we would all say, vote for me and we'll make the Germans pay for everything. And we'll stick it to the Germans. Well, that means we get political leaders who are going to be bent on a program against Germany that ultimately will not preserve peace. And that later on, a guy named Adolf Hitler will take it apart piece by piece. All right, so here's the big problem. The big problem is France. I love France. I go there whenever I can. Going to go again this summer. But the French have got a problem on their hands. They're afraid of being left alone in Europe with Germany. Everyone's going home. England barely came into the war. The Russians, that they had counted on as an ally to make Germany split its forces, they've now gone Soviet. They're not coming back. America took 3 years to get there. It's as if that you live in an apartment complex with a really big bad dude, a bully or whatever, and you get in a fight with him. You don't mean to, maybe. But your friends have come over, and they help you subdue this guy. But your friends got to go home, and you got to live with this guy. And you're thinking, I'm going to kill him, right? I mean, otherwise he's going to kill me later on. Or hobble him, do something to him. And so France really wants Germany to pay and be permanently undermined going forward. They would love to take this area right here, which is German territory between the Rhine River and the boundary here, and make it a new country, kind of like Belgium or Holland, and call it the Rhineland. But Woodrow Wilson believes in something called self-determination. He believes that the people ought to live in a country of their own nationality and make their own decisions. So he's against that. France does get Alsace and Lorraine back. They also seize this area called the Saar Basin, where a tremendous amount of coal and steel gets made. Woodrow Wilson agrees to that. He says after 15 years, we'll have to let the people of that area decide for themselves. What they do agree on is that Germany can no longer have a military. Germany is limited to a 100,000 man National Guard, only for domestic security. Germany loses its navy. Germany loses its overseas colonies. And then finally, Germany is told that it's going to have to pay for the war. And this is your ID, Article 231. Article 231. Think about going through pages and pages of different articles that the Germans are agreeing to. And this is Article 231. It says, Germany accepts full and total responsibility for the war. It's their fault that the war was fought. And they agree to pay whatever bill they're ultimately presented with. Germany accepts full responsibility for the war and will pay whatever amount of money is finally tabulated to be that they owe. The reason they had to write it this way is because Woodrow Wilson is concerned about these reparations. He actually does not think the Germans alone are responsible for the war. He thinks the European states in general made a lot of mistakes leading to the war, including all their big military establishment. And he also can't agree on making the Germans pay all the costs of the war. So they kind of fudge a little bit by saying, we'll leave it to a commission that will add up all the numbers and ultimately Germany will be made to pay. Now, Woodrow Wilson's got one thing that makes him think this could still work. The peace could still be preserved. And that is something called the League of Nations. Y'all know the United Nations today, you kind of know it. But the League of Nations was the first effort of the world to create an international pseudo-government that all the nations would be represented in, and we would try to work with each other for a common good. The creation of the League of Nations is part of the Versailles Treaty. It's a section of it, and it's called the Covenant of the League of Nations Covenant, which I'll be discussing here in a minute. I want to go ahead and look at the new map of Europe that emerges out of this. That map over there, you can see that there are three big powers in the east. So there was the Russian Empire, the German Empire, and the Austrian Empire. But there were all kinds of different nationalities here. So as a result of the war, we have a bunch of people get their freedom. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. The Poles finally come back on the map of Europe. The Czech people, the Slovak people, Hungarians, Romanians, Bulgarians. And then there's a whole bunch of ethnic groups in here, and they just make them all live together in something called Yugoslavia. However, they all hated each other, and it doesn't go very well. On the border here, they got a couple problems. You'll want to know this later on for when you see the coming of World War II and what Hitler does. There's an area, they're going to create something called Czechoslovakia, and they're going to put the Czech people and the Slovakian people into one state. And the reason they want to do this is so that there'd be a strong state over here that could defend themselves against an aggressive Germany. The problem is this area right here is all mountainous. They decided to give that to Czechoslovakia so they'd have a natural border between Germany. I'm looking at that topographical map back there. I guess you can kind of see it. This should be Czechoslovakia right here, or the Czech state. Those mountains are going to be a natural barrier between Germany and the rest of the state. However, most of the people who live up here are German. And Adolf Hitler later on will use that as a reason to go to war with Czechoslovakia. Also, they want to give Poland access to the sea. They give them a corridor here, but most of the people living here are German. Adolf Hitler will use that as well. So Germany, France hopes, is now no longer able to do anything. It's committed to a 100,000-man army. It's got no navy. It's got strong states on its border. It's going to be hobbled with reparations through the 1970s. They won't be able to spend money on this. And there's one more thing that they're interested in. It's Article X, your next ID. Article X. It's actually Roman numeral 10. I mentioned a moment ago that they've created this League of Nations. They've got this covenant, a covenant being the Constitution. It lays out the membership and it lays out the responsibilities and rights of the member states. The 10th article in that covenant it provides for collective security. So the 10th article provides for collective security, stating basically an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. In other words, we'll all come to the defense of a League of Nations member who gets attacked by a rogue state. We today are in such a relationship. Do you know the name of the treaty that we're in that says if an attack on one of us is considered an attack on all of us? It's not the United Nations. It's not the whole world. It's a particular area that we are committed. What is it? NATO. There you go, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But I'll come back to that in a minute. The French are satisfied to think that if Germany, despite all the restraints that are now on it, got it tied up pretty well here, like Houdini maybe. Good luck getting out of this. That even if they were to rearm and become aggressive, the League of Nations would be a way by which the French could get help against Germany. And I think y'all know that none of this is going to work, right? Because of several things that happened between 1919 and 1941 that will make it possible for Adolf Hitler to one by one isolate his enemies and take them out. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson signs the Versailles Treaty. He signs it, and he says he's going to commit America to this thing. We're going to join the League of Nations, and we're going to be a party to this document. We will enforce this document on the Germans. He does that despite the fact that back here in America, a whole bunch of political opinion makers, both Democrat and Republican, left and right, are saying this treaty is not going to work. People like Louis Brandeis, a Supreme Court justice, that he put on the bench is writing articles saying this is not going to work. People on the right in the Republican Party are saying this is not going to work. And so the problem for him is that he's got to get the treaty ratified. Just because he signed it does not bind America to it. We don't let a president bind us in that regard. The Senate has got to ratify it. That means he's got to go to the Senate. And Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, I think he's on your list too, isn't he? He is the Republican leader of the Senate. In November 1918, we'd had what was called the off-year election, and the Republicans took the Senate. And so Woodrow Wilson has got to get the Republicans, and he's a Democrat, right, to ratify this thing. He's made a mistake. He should have taken some Republicans with him to Versailles to help negotiate this, so maybe they could come back and help sell this to the Senate. But Henry Cabot Lodge successfully uses Article 10 to say that we cannot ratify the Versailles Treaty because Article 10 is unconstitutional, would be against the way our Constitution works. He says that Article 10 binds America to go fight in France if the League of Nations proclaims that a country is in the wrong and has invaded another one. He points out that in our Constitution, it is only the Congress that can declare war. Now, in truth, he probably overplayed this to make it out like we would be forced to go, but it does work. And the Republicans in the Senate refused to ratify this treaty. It humiliates Woodrow Wilson, who personally negotiated it as President of the United States, and now it's been rejected by the Senate. But he doesn't give up. He wants another vote on it. So in the meantime, he gets on a train and starts traveling around America, trying to go directly to the American people, kind of like Bryan did back in the 1896 election, and say, this is important. He tries to sell the Versailles Treaty to the American people and explain why that if we don't secure this treaty and don't become party to it, things will be worse than if we don't. During this trip, he suffers a major stroke, and he is incapacitated. He's brought back to, he doesn't die, he's brought back to Washington, taken into the, I guess if he's stabilized, they take him into the White House, take him upstairs to the bedroom, and he spends the next year and a half in that bedroom, unable to speak for all we know. His wife, it's his second wife, he'd lost his first wife years before, he'd married the second one, I think in about 1912, she becomes probably the first female president of the United States because she runs all the cabinet meetings. She won't let anybody go up and talk to him. She says, I'll go tell him he's too weak and I'll come back and tell you what he said. So they would propose, she would literally sit in the cabinet meetings and conduct them. And I've never read to what degree, what kind of policies she tried to use or whether or not she was effective. But the cabinet was very frustrated. They don't understand the condition of the president, and this leads to an amendment, which I really ought to put on the list for future. I'll get into your quiz on this. This leads to amendment, the 25th Amendment to the United States Constitution. This Woodrow Wilson being incapacitated and unable to carry out the functions of the president is going to lead to Congress passing a constitutional amendment, which gets ratified by the country, and it's called the 25th Amendment. And here's what it says. It's a way by which to remove the president from office without an impeachment trial. An impeachment trial is when you impeach a president for crimes and misdemeanors, which are pretty, it's up to interpretation. But this is, what if the president has become incapacitated through something called like a stroke, or what if he's gone bonkers and can't be trusted with power? Well, who would be in a position to know? His cabinet would be. So here's the way the procedure works. If the cabinet meets and declares that the president is bonkers or incapacitated and cannot carry out the function of the president, then they recommend that he be removed and be replaced with the vice president. Now, if you left it just there, doesn't that create a little bit of a vulnerability? What if you had a vice president who manipulated things and got rid of a president, right? So we can't have that. So we got to have some check on this thing. So if the cabinet meets and decides this, then it goes to the Senate. The Senate hears the evidence of the cabinet against the president, and then the Senate, if the Senate votes in favor, then the president is removed, and the vice president becomes President Pence, for instance. So that is a set up as a result of this, and it's never been used. There was some question about it when Ronald Reagan went into, he got an assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan early in his first term, and he was going into surgery, and they were wondering, do they need to pass power to the vice president? But they actually didn't do it, from what I recall. All right, couple little things left here on the implications of the war, and this one is still with us today. What do we call this part of the world? The Middle East. And is the Middle East a mega mess? Right? It's just been a mess. And a big part of the mess that exists in the Middle East is quite honestly the fault of Britain and France. Because what they do at the end, at Versailles, this, y'all see this down here, this green? This is the Ottoman Empire. Going up, this is the Turks who came over to Europe from probably northern Afghanistan, a Muslim fighting group, took over actually all over this whole area, but they've slowly receded in size. I think I talked about the sick men of Europe, how they're getting smaller. Well, now that they've been on the losing side of the war, we're going to well, the Sultan has to step down. Well, he may already be gone, but this is how we get the country Turkey today. It's the remnant of the Ottoman Empire, with the capital still in Istanbul or Constantinople. But this territory down here, they're going to make new states. Some of them will be administered by England, and some of them will be administered by France. It's called the mandate system. Basically, France and England wanted to control this territory, probably because the oil that they're beginning to recognize is here plentifully. And also, I don't know if you remember the map, but Europe, France and England have got colonies all over the world, all over Africa, all over India, and Southeast Asia. So this is par for the course for them. But this, let's hone in on Baghdad, on Iraq. The way that the English did colonization, when they went far, far away from England and colonized people, they would find the natural rivalries. Everywhere they went, there's groups of people that hate each other, and they've been enemies forever. And what the British would do is play them off each other. So what they do to create Iraq is they take three groups that hate each other and put them in one government, in one state. So we've got Shia Muslims over here on the eastern side of the Euphrates River. And then over in the western side of Iraq are Sunni Muslims. They hate each other, and they've been fighting over Baghdad for over 1,000 years. And we add to that a third group called the Kurds up in the north. And if you've accidentally watched any news and you hear about the Kurds or the Shia or the Sunnis, they all live here together, and they are going to hate each other. Saddam Hussein, who's Sunni, the Sunnis pretty much dominate all during the 20th century because the British work with the Sunni tribes to be the ones, but they can play off the Shia and the Kurds against them too. Up here in Syria, where the civil war's been going on now for what, 6-7 years, they take Alawite Christians, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, and kind of some gypsy groups, non-Muslims, and they make them all live together in a group. Hasn't gone well, has it? But here's the one I want to hone in on. You've got an ID for it. This is Palestine. They decided to create a state called Palestine. What's Palestine? Where did they get the name Palestine? Anybody have a Bible that's got maps in it? Would you kind of recognize the look of that thing, a piece of property? That looks like the borders of Israel back during the time of King David. Well, I need to go back and let you know about something called Zionism, because Zionism is what's going to lead to the Balfour Declaration. Kind of complicated. Bear with me, though, because it's important for you guys to understand the problems over in the Middle East. The Jewish population controlled Israel on and off from about 1600 BC till about 88 AD, off and on. The Greeks sometimes controlled them, the Egyptians sometimes controlled them, but sometimes they were alone. But the Romans, the last one to control them, the Romans got so frustrated with the Jewish population that they threw them out of this small piece of property. It's called the diaspora. The Jewish population remembers this as the moment when they're thrown out of their land. And that's about 80 AD, nearly over almost 2,000 years ago. And the Jewish population now begins to move to other cities in Greece, and eventually a Jewish population emerges and lives here. Millions of Jews living in Eastern Europe grow in the next couple thousand years, but they're always poorly treated by the Europeans. In Eastern Europe, Jews have to live in separate villages if they're in the countryside. If they live in cities, they have to live in segregated parts of the city. Those parts of the city were called a ghetto. In fact, the word ghetto comes from the Jewish. In the western part of Europe, beginning in the 1600s, the western part of Europe began to let Jews become full citizens and intermarry with the other population. And so the Western Jews they look just like the rest of the population. But the Eastern European Jews have different clothing styles, but the Western European Jews became very wealthy in banking. And the Eastern European Jews were really, really poor. So this guy named Theodor Herzl, a Hungarian Jew, in the 1880s writes a book about how the Jews of Europe will never be safe, and that what they need to do is return to where? Return to Palestine. And that's the word Zionism. Zionism was the belief that the Jewish people needed to restore a nation in the traditional homeland that they've been reading about in their Torah for the last 2,000 years. They call it Zion because there was a period of time when the Babylonians captured Palestine, and they took all these Jews to, what was Nebuchadnezzar? Where would that have been? Well, Babylon. Yeah, Babylon in captivity. And they used to talk about Zion, where they wanted to go back to. So Zionism becomes an international movement of Jews wanting to move to what was then the Ottoman Empire, right? Okay, here's what happens. Poor Eastern European Jews are willing to go to Palestine, but they can't afford it. Wealthy Western European Jews begin to sponsor colonization. And all during the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century, Jews begin to move to Palestine, sponsored by wealthy Jews in the West. The local people don't like it. They don't like these Jews coming in with money and buying up farm property. And most of the people living here are Muslim or Catholic or Greek Orthodox. The Ottoman Empire eventually says we can't have any more Jews coming in, and they stop it. They stop any more further immigration. But now this piece of property is in the control of England, right? And the Balfour Declaration here for you finally. Lord Balfour was the British foreign minister. So he speaks on foreign policy, Lord Balfour. And he makes a declaration one day that gets news. He declares, makes it known, that the British government looks favorably upon the eventual establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. That's his declaration. He's coming out saying we're in favor of this. The British government looks favorably at eventually a Jewish state being established in Palestine. Now it appears he spoke out of turn, that was not yet the policy of the government, and he had to walk it back. But next thing I'd like you to know, the question becomes, why does he do it? And I think, in my reading, it's the role of Jewish bankers in England, like the Rothschilds and such, who are Zionists. They want this. And I think it's very natural that they should try to get this accomplished. And they have loaned England a lot of money for the war. I think they're saying, we've done this, now you do this for us. It was highly complicated. It remains so. The British will begin to allow Jews to move into Palestine. It leads to a lot of friction with lots of violence in Palestine. Eventually, the British have to stop it. But then there's World War II, and there's the destruction of 6 million Jews. And the Jews after World War II, well, they go to Palestine, right? They're convinced they'll never be safe in Europe. And they come in here after World War II with a lot of military training, and they fight it out with the Jewish population, the indigenous population, and they create their own state. And America becomes the first nation to recognize them, because the Democratic Party in America had a large number of Jews in it. The Republican Party really doesn't like it. Y'all don't know this yet, but Jews weren't liked in America among Protestants, especially in the South. The South did not like Catholics, and the South did not like Jewish people. When I was in high school still, which was in the 80s, my girlfriend, whose father was the president of the National Bank in Abilene, Texas, we were just all talking one day, and anti-Jewish conversation started up. And she said the reason they wore these little things on the back of their head is to hide the horns. The horns that they have. This is an affluent girl who, so these kind of stories were very prevalent in the South. It's not till the evangelical movement of the 1960s and 70s where evangelicals begin to see the return of Israel as being the end day scenario, that this is finally the return of Jesus, and they become more and more pro-Jewish, and now evangelicals are very pro-Jewish. By the way, speaking of evangelicals, he's not on your ID list right now, but Billy Graham will be on your next ID list, your last one, because he played a really important role in the 20th century, so I will be pursuing him. All right, that's all. We haven't even talked about the Russian Revolution, have we? You guys are ready to go. I can see it. You're like, please, God, let us out of here. I guess I'm letting you out 2 minutes early. The Russians, the Soviets, are now on the board. And that's going to, the whole Cold War is a result of World War I, too. So it's just a mess. See you guys on Monday.
Sorry about being late. I was using the bathroom.
Okay, I'll adjust that.
All right, thank you.
You bet. Good luck to you.
You said I can come in between classes?
Yeah, and look at your notes.